So, today we're going to watch the first half hour, give or take, of this PBS special, The Road to Calvary. And I saw it on Channel 2 maybe a year ago at Thanksgiving time, when we were getting ready for the night before, getting ready for Thanksgiving. And I was very impressed with it. I mean, there were some things when I watched it that I did not agree with, but I appreciated it very much because it really digs a little deeper into the background. And there's I think it's in what we'll see today, there's a scale model of Jerusalem at the time of Jesus. I'm in, and it's as big as this room, you know. And just one of the things that has been very meaningful to me in the reading that I've done in the last 10 to 15 years is I've been attracted to a theologian named N.T. Wright, W-R-I-G-H-T. He's an Anglican bishop in Durham. And he writes, I mean, he writes all the time. And he is a very historically based biblical scholar. So I've learned a lot about the understanding of Jesus as the Messiah and what was going on in Jerusalem at that time and what was going on in Judaism at that time. And this really, I thought, got into that. I watched it again Thursday night. And there are some parts more in the second half, what we'll see next week, that I really had trouble with. But there's nothing wrong with seeing something that we don't agree with, just to get a different perspective. And if you've got questions about what the narrator or whatever you call him says, we'll talk about those. And if you don't ask the questions that I want to answer, I'll just ask them and answer them. Dan, you got a question already?
Oh, what's the difference between historical and contextual? When you talk about that, it's kind of the same thing.
It would be the same thing.
Yeah.
But with N.T. Wright,
I know you talked about this from the seminary.
Yeah. There are some, let's say some of my professors started with a Lutheran look at the Bible, and everything they read agreed with Luther. N.T. Wright starts with more the historical background, and then looks at what are we reading here. And that's been a very helpful shift for me. I'm still Lutheran, but I'm not, I see things differently than what Luther did, who had a different context. You know, I mean, with his issues with the Catholic Church are not mine. You know, and so that colors, you know, where he started from and how he got into it, as opposed to how we might look at it. All right? And talk about context. You know, one of the things that I'll comment on next week, or I anticipate I'll comment on next week, is the context of this guy's production, because it's in Jerusalem, and he's dealing with Jerusalem people, and I think that colors this, rather than, you know, having stepped back. He's got to get along with those people. So we'll see what you think. Anyway, I thought it was well worthwhile, and Michelle can tell you, I was worried most of the week, are we going to have church today or not? Or are we going to change the time of the service and have it later so we can all shovel out? And I'd have been very sad if we hadn't had an opportunity to watch this. So anyway, Doug, if you would please. If somebody wants to hit the lights once Doug's got it going. Well, anyway, what the guy says early on is Jerusalem is where faith and tradition come together. That's not the Holy Spirit, because otherwise it's white.
This is a place where history and faith come together.
Oh, yeah.
Tradition has it that in a tomb like this, the body of a Jewish healer and preacher from Nazareth called Jesus was laid to rest in about 30 AD, nearly 2,000 years ago. He'd been crucified at the place not far from here, known as the Hill of the Skull, Golgotha, or you might know it as Calvary. Whether you are a person of faith or of none, you cannot escape the fact that the last 6 days of this man's life and his death changed the world. I'm not going to chart the religion that grew out of these events. I'm interested in the events themselves. What happened in that final week of Jesus' life? How he died, why he died, and who killed him? Because 2,000 years later, here at what is traditionally said to be the site of his crucifixion and burial, the legacy of those final few days is unavoidable. For Christians, what played out on this stage, Jerusalem, over the 6 days after Jesus' arrival, became their Holy Week, the first Easter. But at the time, it was a political power play. In that 1 week, Jesus provoked the city's political and religious authorities. The response was, they saw him as a threat that needed to be taken out. But why? Why, over the course of just a few days, did one man go from hero to troublemaker? From preacher to problem? Arrested and publicly humiliated. Tradition tells us that Jesus arrived here on a wave of populism on a Sunday, yet by the following Friday, he was dead on a cross. Did he have any idea, when he first entered the city, that the countdown to Calvary had begun? I've been to Jerusalem just once before, 30 years ago, as a backpacking student about to start my theology degree at Cambridge. The city fascinated me. It is so important to Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And now I'm back, I'm looking forward to rekindling my youthful curiosity. Now, I brought with me some ancient texts. Ancient, insofar as I haven't opened most of these for 30 years. The Dead Sea Scrolls by Giza Koresh. History of the Early Church, Common Patristic Law, the big one, the Common Bible, RSV version. Secret Heaven, Israel and Egypt, the Nubian Chancellor, both of the New Testament, Synoptic Gospels, and this was the go-to book for any student of theology, Higgs Commentary on the Bible. I eventually exchanged one passion for another, but as a student, I was drawn to the drama of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Synoptic Gospels, from the Greek meaning they look the same. They tell a similar, occasionally identical tale, while John's Gospel has a more reflective take on the same story. I was gripped by the differing, sometimes contradictory threads of the narrative, forensically trying to piece together what actually happened in that final week. Whatever the difference is, the story they're telling is a simple one, and they all agree on it. They're spreading the word about Jesus Christ, the Son of God, made man. But I also want to try to put this crucial part of the gospel story in its historical context. I'd like to know more about the Roman governor Pontius Pilate, and Caiaphas, the Jewish high priest, and perhaps the most intriguing of them all, Judas Iscariot. All these fascinating characters who were actors in this sequence of events that led to the birth of an entirely new religion. And it all took place here on this extraordinary stage in Jerusalem. 2,000 years ago, right today, Jerusalem was a place of pilgrimage, especially at Passover, an annual Jewish celebration of liberation from tyranny and oppression. Tens of thousands converged on Jerusalem and its great temple, all under the watchful eye of the city's recent conqueror, the Roman Empire. But around 30 AD, Passover in Jerusalem witnessed one of the greatest stories ever told. Helen Bond is a professor of Christian origins and has brought me to the Museum of Israel to show me the impressive scale model replica of Jerusalem at the time of Jesus, and its centerpiece, the temple.
Oh my goodness. I hadn't realised the footprint of the temple was quite massive.
That's right, it's the size of 12 football stadiums, and it is huge. And the fact is that it's on high as well. I think it must have just absolutely dominated the whole place. You see the Antonia Fortress just over there on the corner?
Four towers.
And you can see actually the difference really clearly. That's the upper city there where you've got the large houses, the wealthy people, the mansions, and then down there you've got the lower city where the poor people live.
This is even better than Legoland.
Yeah.
So within this walled area, it's estimated 30,000 people live normally, and this swelled to how much at Passover?
It's difficult to know, 200,000 to 300,000, so maybe even as much as 10 times its ordinary size.
Yeah.
Not everyone is necessarily staying within the city. Some are in tents outside, or places like Bethany, where Jesus is said to be. But certainly you're absolutely crammed to that, isn't you?
The museum also has one tiny corner which allows me to connect with the historical reality of the story and the characters involved.
Just here. If we start with this is the so-called Pilate stone. It's the only inscription that has Pilate's name in it, so you can just make it out. The half of the stone is obliterated, but there is Pilatus, and it's the only really tangible link that we have with Pilate. But another important thing about it is Praefectus, it says there, so it shows that he's in charge sort of troops, and his main task is to maintain law and order. In the same way that that's our one tangible connection with Pontius Pilate, this is our one tangible link with the high priest Caiaphas. And this is actually a bone box. When the high priest Caiaphas died, his body was laid out for a year or so, and then his bones gathered together and put in a box. And it's actually got a carving on the side that gives his name. It says, very hard to read, it's in Aramaic, Joseph of Caiaphas. So Joseph Caiaphas, and that's exactly the same name as the man in the New Testament who is the high priest of the Jews at the time of Jesus. There's another interesting object as well, this time not so much to do with the rulers of Judea, but this is a heel bone, and it's got this iron nail stuck through it. And what's really important about this is that it's the only remains of a crucified victim that we have from this time period.
It's quite peculiar. I wasn't expecting that relics would have any impact on me. They don't normally. But to have these three elements brought together in one place, it does seem to take the story out of the literature that I'm used to into something that is historical and tangible.
Yes, I mean, we know from these objects that Pilate and Caiaphas did exist. This is something we can actually touch and be connected to that first century setting through those things.
Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of Judea, was, as the Gospels tell it, a weak and malleable man who was pressurized by the Jews to crucify Jesus. His base was Caesarea on the Mediterranean coast. He and his soldiers only came to Jerusalem for festivals like Passover, to remind the locals who was really in charge. So Pilate and his train, to get his train, went all the way from Caesarea, which is 90 kilometers that way, into Jerusalem this way. What's the local Jewish population going to make of this arrival?
I think they would have hated it. Most of the time, the Roman presence is actually quite small around here. You're not really aware of Roman soldiers as such, and certainly don't so much Pilate, but as this Pilate is going to come in, it's Passover, he's there, the whole point of him coming in is to make his presence felt. The Jews have only been a Roman province for about 20 years, so it's still in that sort of state of flux. They're getting used to Roman occupation, and it's really Pilate's role to make sure that everything is quiet. I mean, the point is to show military might. This is Rome in all its glory. Don't mess with us.
Judea was a remote outpost of the Roman Empire.
For Pilate, if trouble broke out, reinforcements were weeks away, so he depended on rule by collaboration. He needed eyes and ears and muscle on the street. The troops he brought with him were garrisoned in the Antonia fortress, which overlooked the Great Temple. It's a key location in the story.
This is the site of the Roman Antonia fortress, where a cohort, 400 to 600 troops, were permanently garrisoned, and traditionally it's where Pilate would have stayed during Passover, and therefore where he sentenced Jesus to death. And that's why today it marks the start of the weekly Via Dolorosa walk, the way of sorrow, for pilgrims to follow the final journey of Jesus from condemnation to crucifixion. From the fortress, the Romans kept their eye on the Jewish temple. You still get a sense of that, but now on the same site, you're actually looking down on one of the holiest sites in Islam, and the place where Muslims believe Muhammad ascended into heaven. Some modern scholars question whether this is where Pilate stayed, and therefore whether judgment on Jesus was passed here, but nevertheless, it's a perfect example of the relationship between the Romans and the Jewish authorities. The tower of the Antonia fortress looked out over the whole Temple Mount, so the Romans could keep an eye on what was going on there day and night. And also the high priest's ceremonial robes that were only worn on special feast days like Passover, and without which the high priest didn't have any authority, were locked here in the Antonia fortress. So the Romans literally held the key to Jewish power in the city, which meant that the governor, Pontius Pilate, controlled Caiaphas, the city's religious and political leader.
When Pilate wasn't in town, Caiaphas the high priest was the boss. In principle at least, he was in day-to-day charge of the city, and of course, the temple. But he understood how his own power and wealth depended on collaboration with the Romans. To appreciate his status, you have to go underground.
In the late 1960s, excavations in the southwest part of the city, known as the Upper City, revealed this.
These first-century ruins were home to Caiaphas and Jerusalem's elite class. Impressive houses with ornate mosaics, running water, ritual baths and courtyards. Paula Fredrickson, a professor of scripture and comparative religion, has a rich insight into the Jewish politics of the time.
This is the neighborhood that has the mansions. It was developed initially by Herod the Great, who put his own palace here. It's where the chief priests, who are aristocrats themselves, live, and it's where the high priest lives. So these are people who are not only aristocracy within their own societies, but they are temple aristocracy too, because they have positions of premier responsibility for the smooth running of the temple. In the Roman period, these people have to be able to cooperate with the Roman governor, and they had a good working relationship. Caiaphas and Pilate were together for almost 10 years, and that meant that they were on the same page. Both of them wanted to minimize bloodshed, and that's what they cooperated in order to do.
So, in the balance of power between the Jewish authorities and the Romans, how easy is it to tip one way or the other?
The Roman prefect kept his job by keeping the peace, but Jerusalem at Passover is a pressure cooker, and it doesn't take a lot to get it out of equilibrium.
So, even before Jesus arrived, Jerusalem was tense. People on the streets angry at their religious leaders for colluding with the Romans, and angry at the Romans for being there.
And now we're in the middle of a festival celebrating the Jews' liberation from tyranny. The population of Jerusalem, usually around 30,000, has swollen tenfold. And you've got religious pilgrims yearning for freedom from the yoke of Roman rule, praying for divine intervention. It's not going to take much to start a riot.
Security forces in the city were watching everyone from everywhere, which brings into play one of the most important characters in our story, the mob. The crowd swarming into Jerusalem for Passover, turning up the religious and political heat. One independent source that corroborates the Gospel story is the Jewish Roman historian Josephus. His eyewitness accounts depict this period as a time of chaos. Dr. Zanika Rogers, an expert on Jewish life at the time,
sees him as a crucial witness.
His works are a veritable who's who of New Testament characters. He has Caiaphas, Pilate, but also John the Baptist and Jesus. He's building up a picture of a society that is completely and utterly divided politically. And of course, much of the division is about Roman rule, is about attitudes towards the Romans. The Romans cannot tolerate any possibility of the disintegration of law and order by political unrest. And they would see militant unrest the same way as prophetic teachers gathering in group around them promising deliverance. They're all a threat to security and stability. And that's what the Romans want, stability. They realize, especially around festival times, that Jerusalem is a flashpoint for political unrest.
Sunday, the day Jesus arrived in Jerusalem. He would be dead by Friday. Did he appreciate that the city was a political tinderbox, a time bomb? Jesus and his followers were approaching the city from the southeast, the opposite side to the Roman governor, Pilate. By now, all of Jerusalem would have been pumped up for Passover. Father Gregory Tatum from Jerusalem's Calvary Peak is an authority on the early Jesus movement. What was different about Jesus as a teacher, and how would his message have been received in the city?
The first thing that would be unusual among your average preacher or teacher would have been, first off, that he was a miracle worker. The second thing that would have been remarkable would have been that his focus was so clearly eschatological, meaning the end of time, the definitive outworking of God's plans for history, referring to the end of days, and therefore focused on national repentance and being prepared for Judgment Day, basically.
So, bringing that message through that gate in the eastern side of Jerusalem at a time of Passover with a military-controlled force like the Romans, that's a pretty dangerous thing to be preaching at a time like this in these circumstances, isn't it?
Your expression of tinderbox is spot on, because the crowds, it being Passover, and the preaching of the eschatological kingdom of God are certainly a combination of features that make it very likely that Jesus could set off a riot, and a riot can escalate into an uprising, and an uprising can escalate into a revolt against Rome.
According to tradition, Sunday was the moment of Jesus' triumphant entry into Jerusalem, the first Palm Sunday. But perhaps it wasn't so much his actual arrival that was considered a threat. It was the message he brought with him.
In Galilee, Jesus had talked about the power of God working within him, about a new kingdom of God being established based on social justice, love, compassion. Now, the word kingdom would have made the Romans and the Jewish authorities sit up and take notice. For the Romans, anything that undermined the absolute authority of Caesar was treason. And for the Jewish establishment, preaching that seemed to challenge its power or even hint at religious reform meant danger.
But it's the crowd flocking to Jesus, euphoric at this time of a festival of liberation, alive with messianic expectation, who identify Jesus as a king, fulfilling a prophecy from their own scriptures. Behold, your king comes to you. He is just and having salvation, lowly and riding upon an ass.
I've always thought that this is a crucial twist in the story. It's not Jesus who is calling himself the Messiah, literally the anointed king. It's the crowds, the mob. So who is really stirring up the tensions here? And it seems the Roman authorities had a reputation for dealing harshly with those who attracted popular support. There's one ominous passage in the writings of the Jewish historian Josephus about a cousin of Jesus, the man the Gospels know as John the Baptist.
When others too joined the crowds about him, because they were aroused to the highest degree by his sermons, Herod became alarmed. Herod decided, therefore, that it would be much better to strike first and be rid of him before his work led to an uprising. Though John, because of Herod's suspicions, was brought in chains to Machaerus and there put to death. Now that's really, really interesting, because the idea of putting down the noisy mob seems to be not dissimilar to a lot of the discussion about what happened in Jesus' case. Not necessarily what he was saying, or what claims may or may not have been made about his status, religious status or political status, but it's just the fact that where lots of people are gathered together, it's potentially dangerous for law and order.
Well, according to Josephus, it is. What he wants to show is that society is disintegrating and slowly but surely moving towards chaos. And he also names Jewish individuals that attract followers and that Roman authorities are very nervous about and want to deal with immediately.
Even on the day he entered the city, people were proclaiming him a messianic savior, a new king, and as such, a direct threat to Roman rule. But would he, as a good observant Jew in town for Passover, dare to confront the Jewish authorities in the house of God? In the time of Jesus, the entire reason for the Passover pilgrimage was to visit the temple, the house of God, and sacrifice an animal for the Passover meal. Today, the western wall of what was that temple is still the most important place in Judaism. But imagine what this would be like with hundreds of thousands of people all trying to get into the temple for the Passover festival. The archaeologist Professor Ronnie Wright has spent much of his career leading excavations to uncover first-century Jerusalem. Jesus was one of tens of thousands of pilgrims who walked through these triple arches which led into the temple, climbed these southern steps, and walked these actual streets. This is the pavement, these are the streets of first-century Jerusalem, these are the shops, these are where the moneylenders would have had their...
Well, our colleague from 2,000 years ago, Jesus of Nazareth, would have walked here. I mean, this is downtown. Here people used to buy things, used to change money. For example, for the temple tax, people came from all over the country and also from abroad with their money in various denominations, and they used to change it into the half shekel as temple tax.
So if you're going to the temple, you're going to pay the temple tax. So when we have the incident in the temple of Jesus overturning the tables, he's not complaining about the principle of the tax, is he?
No, but I can imagine, this is now my interpretation, that, money changed hands here. And when rather naive people come from the country, and here are some corrupt changes, might happen, right?
Exchange rate.
We just probably stood from the side and saw how these occasionally cheat on the farmers who came from outside, etc. And this probably can imagine, because it's the cheating which disturbed him, right? Cheating in the place of God. So I see.
He said to them, "It is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a den of robbers."
Maybe the statement is really about being the purest Jew you can be and should be as you approach Passover. And it's become commercialized. That sounds fairly familiar.
So, the idea that power and a privileged status quo breed corruption is nothing new. That society needs those who are prepared to stand up and be counted. Interestingly, 2,000 years ago, Jesus wasn't the only voice critical of the temple. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered 60 years ago in Qumran, not far from Jerusalem, proved that there were many who considered the Jewish authorities to be corrupt at the highest level. They would feel God's wrath and punishment at the end of the world.
I think it's safe to say that there never was a single form of Judaism. There isn't now, and there wasn't in antiquity. So this is a group that's actively against the current administration of the temple, and they come up with their own, Josephus calls them a Haresis, a school, their own sect of Judaism.
The Qumran community abandoned Jerusalem not to start a new religion, but simply to preserve and protect their spiritual purity.
Is it fair to say that one could say the same of Jesus? He was not trying to create a new religion from it. His message seems to be everyone pull their socks up and focus on what is at the heart of Judaism. Is that fair?
I think putting Jesus against the wallpaper of first century Jewish diversity makes us appreciate how Jewish his message was. Like the Dead Sea Scroll community, he's convinced that his version of Judaism is the one that really makes the most sense and is truest to the Bible. So what we have when we look at the traditions about Jesus is somebody who, like all these other different sects of Judaism, are looking at the same Jewish biblical sheet music and playing improv off of that sheet music.
Jesus had only been in Jerusalem for a few days, but already his words and actions were making waves. The question has to be asked, isn't it likely that Jesus knew exactly what he was doing? Tuesday morning, Jerusalem is waking up. In just a few days, Jesus will be under arrest. According to the Gospels, after his triumphal entry into Jerusalem and the so-called temple incident, the Jewish authorities became fixated on one thing: killing Jesus.
For they were afraid of him, and because of the crowds being spellbound by his teaching. Surely today is the day for Jesus to keep his head down.
But he didn't. He returned to the temple to preach and to be challenged. By what authority are you doing these things? Who is it gave you this authority? Is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor? The priests were trying to catch him out, to make him blaspheme or criticize Caesar. Either would have sealed his fate. But Jesus, a good Jew, understood the power of debate. It's been a part of Jewish culture for thousands of years. This is a yeshiva, a type of Jewish school that explores traditional religious texts and truths through group debate and argument.
And having been to yeshiva before, this is quite my opener. To see the sheer numbers of people learning this technique of interpretation and scholarship, delving into the scriptures.
The Gospels say that Jesus, a passionate and opinionated Jew, spoke with power and authority. You get a real sense of that spirit here.
One guy was telling me they start at 7 in the morning and go on until late in the evening. He said, it's great, you just debate and you learn and you dig into the scripture. Not unlike the debates that would have taken place in the temple in the first century.
But crucially, the Gospels tell us Jesus also spoke that day, and not for the first time, about one specific thing: the destruction of the temple he was standing in, and the end of the world. Truly I tell you, not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down. Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. 40 years after Jesus' death, the temple was actually destroyed by the Romans in retaliation for a Jewish uprising. The historian Josephus saw it as a punishment by God for the sins of the people. The Gospel writers saw it as the fulfillment of the prophecy made by Jesus. And the historical reality is still here. Those first century temple ruins have now been uncovered.
Now, this isn't just a pile of any old stones.
No. This is the destruction of the western wall of the Temple Mount, as done by the Romans after the sack of Jerusalem. And I've seen here people, religious Orthodox people, turn very emotional and weep when they see this, because here is the wall complete, here it is destroyed.
A lot of sites we visited, actually, I find this the most
moving, because
It's
it is
moving, yeah.
a symbol of one culture stamping out another. The symbolism of it speaks for itself.
The temple and its ruins are still a vital touchstone, and not just for Jews. You have to remember the Christian Gospels were written after the fall of the temple, so the Gospel writers knew about its destruction and were aware of the sense of brokenness and hopelessness among the Jewish people. But these Gospels could offer their readers good news, a way forward despite the ruined temple. Not initially a new religion, but a new movement, and crucially, one that was on offer not only to Jews, but to everyone, even the Romans.
The Romans really were expert at showing who was in charge, and one of the ways they did that was by the humiliation of those who did not conform. The humiliation and degradation of Jesus on the cross is matched by the complete destruction of the temple. Clearly any type of insurrection or disturbance of the Roman authority was met with zero tolerance.
3 days in, and I'm left in no doubt that Roman rule in this city was uncompromising. And certainly, Jesus was on their radar. Equally, he had provoked the temple authorities. Perhaps it was time to rest and regroup.
At the end of that Tuesday, rather than make the journey all the way back to Bethany over the top of the hill, Jesus and his disciples, we're told, spent the night here on the Mount of Olives. With the city full to capacity, pilgrims would camp anywhere they could find a space. And across the valley over there in the city, everyone seemed to have an issue with Jesus, at least the loyalty of his disciples. Didn't he?
Doug, we'll stop it there. Allison, you want to hit those lights? Thoughts, comments, questions? Green.
The Jewish people now that have the Jewish males that have curls down here in the little boxes, what's in the box, and was this the same type of group that was around in Jesus' time?
In the box is a scripture.
Okay.
And I think it's Deuteronomy 6:4. I'm not sure. It would be the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength. And in the Levitical code, that is the 613 laws in the Old Testament given to Moses also on Mount Sinai, the Jews are commanded by God to bind these words as a sign on your forehead. And so they have taken that literally, put it in a box, and tied it around their head, just like they'll wear a prayer shawl or a talit. Some wear it all the time, others when they pray, or the yarmulke. And those long sideburns.
Earlocks, aren't they?
Earlocks, sideburns, they are, those are Orthodox Jews. And might be Hasidic, but not necessarily.
But that would be like one aspect, one of the sects that were around.
Right. In Jesus' day, there were the Sadducees. The high priest was a Sadducee, governed only by the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Okay. The Pharisees, who we hear most about in the New Testament, who are the progressives in Judaism, Orthodox still, but the Pharisees were born during the exile. They read the whole Old Testament. There are the Essenes, referred to in what we just saw as the Dead Sea Scroll community, the source of the Dead Sea Scroll, and then the Zealots, who are, Barabbas was a zealot, interested in throwing the Romans out of the Holy Land. These groups don't necessarily get along. In fact, one of the striking things about Jesus' last days is the Pharisees collaborate with the Sadducees to have him arrested and crucified, even though they do not agree on much. The Pharisees are most interested in taking God's word seriously. The Sadducees, it's all about worship at the temple. And so Caiaphas, the author here makes reference to Caiaphas and Pilate having a close relationship for 10 years. Had to be so because Pilate controlled access to the temple, and for the Sadducees especially, everything was about the temple. The Pharisees, because they were born into exile, their worship is as geared to the synagogue as to the temple. Now in Judaism today, you have various sorts of Orthodox Jews. In our community, they live in the neighborhood where Allison's parents went to school. You know where that is?
Highland Park.
In Highland Park. Why? Because that's where the Orthodox synagogues are, and an Orthodox Jew can't drive a car on the Sabbath, so they have to walk or take a cab. A Gentile can help them get to the synagogue, but they can't drive a car. Why? Because that's to remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Then you have conservative Jews who are less Orthodox than the Orthodox. They might keep kosher, but they could drive a car or turn the light on. If you're Orthodox, you can't turn the light on, because that would be the 21st century equivalent of lighting a fire, and to light a fire is work. So, before the Sabbath starts, you plug a crock pot in, or you set the timer on your oven, because you can't turn the oven on either, because that would be the equivalent of lighting a fire.
Do you know some ovens come with Sabbath settings?
That might be. We've only bought Gentile ovens, so I'm not sure.
You have a Gentile operating oven, so I have
Right.
So a friend of mine has an oven that has a Sabbath setting, where you set it and you get it ready, and then you just turn on the Sabbath setting. And she's Lutheran. I mean, they don't.
Yeah.
So really cool.
And then the other group in Judaism in our country are the Reformed, who are, I mean, some are quite serious, but they're more loosely living, their relationship with the commandment, all 613 commandments is looser. I mean, if you're an Orthodox Jew, we had, when I was growing up, Mr. and Mrs. Goldstein were Orthodox Jews. They had 2 sets of dishes in their kitchen. Why?
Meat and
Dad? Because you don't mix milk with meat. So a Reformed probably have 1 set of, I mean, they'd have good dishes, but you know, I mean, not 2 sets of everyday dishes.
But the Orthodox really love their Greek yogurt.
Do they?
Ask Moshe.
I know when our brother-in-law was running a meat packing plant in Buffalo Lake, Minnesota, they had a Jew,
A rabbi.
somebody
It was a rabbi.
who was
He
there to make sure that the beef was kosher.
He had to cut the jugular.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Kate?
Even in my hometown, there was a packing plant, and they would have to have a rabbi there to do that. I watch a little HGTV and watch them redo things. One time they had to do a Jewish kitchen, 2 separate things. And I thought, wow, it's really taking it, you know, my viewpoint, beyond what is necessary, but that was what they believed.
You have to remember that the Pharisees, who are the forebears of our Orthodox Jews today, the Pharisees, because they were born convinced that the reason for the exile was because of the corruption in Jerusalem at the time that the Babylonians conquered the city and destroyed the city walls. And so in their 70 years in Babylon, their quest is, what must we do so that this never happens again? And that's the birth or the source of their concern to take the Word of God as seriously, meaning as literally as possible. So you have volumes and volumes called the Talmud and the Mishnah still being written today that are interpretations of the 613 laws, answering the question, if the Sabbath cannot be violated, can a person flick on a light? No, because in the Mishnah or the Talmud, the rabbis have decided that that's akin to lighting a fire, which was forbidden. Okay.
So I work with this Orthodox rabbi in Canada at the Greek yogurt factory, and he's got the curls, right? Grade A rules say you have to wear a hairnet, and all the hair has to be covered. And he's refusing to put his into the hairnet. I said, well, then you're not going in, I'm sorry. And so he put his hairnet down over he had his yarmulke over the hairnet. I said, okay. His name is Moshe, or Moses.
I had an Orthodox Jewish professor in college, and whenever he traveled somewhere, he carried a head of lettuce with him, because he wasn't sure he'd be able to eat what was served, but he knew the lettuce that he brought from home was acceptable. You know, I mean, for some people to practice their religious beliefs, it takes some work. You know, not that it doesn't for us. What else?
Now the Gentiles were also there, right, or were in Jerusalem? So that would add another something to the pot.
There's a fifth on his list.
Yeah,
for sure, yeah, because there would be Gentiles, including Romans. Okay.
And everyone wants to get what they think is right.
Right. Let me suggest one of the biggest issue that I have with what we heard today is I am no longer convinced that Jesus' problem with the temple was that there was cheating. I'm convinced he had much bigger issues with the temple. And we can talk more about this next time. I'll just plant the seed today. Doug?
Just the fact that there was a tax to start with to get in there.
Well, because they were in cahoots with the Romans, weren't they?
What?
They were kind of in cahoots with the Romans, weren't they, at the temple?
In order to keep it open, yes. The reason why there were money changers is because you have to pay the temple tax with the coin. Jesus was not against paying a tax.
Well, that's what he said on this video.
Right. Render to Caesar that which bears Caesar's image, and render to God that which bears God's image. I think his issue with the temple is twofold. The guy, that's why I checked, the guy cut off what Jesus said when he cleared the temple. And what he said is, it is written, my house shall be a house of prayer for all nations. The guy didn't say that when he quoted. It's in Mark. The temple was the most segregated space on the face of the earth. We've talked about that before. No Gentiles past this point. No women, Jewish women past this point. No lay people past this point. Only the high priest behind the curtain in the temple. Sure, yeah. Okay? So, why does he, this is from the Psalms, why does he quote this psalm? I think now, it has to do with segregation. You know, in one of the lessons that I was tempted to preach on the gospel today because it was such a hard text. But my first week back, I thought I could do Joseph. It's not quite as much work. And I had a full week, you know. So, but in the gospel for this morning, it's like Luke's version of in Matthew when Jesus says, God sends His rain, R-A-I-N, on the just and the unjust. And His sun, S-U-N, rises on the evil and the good. God's love is all-inclusive, right? God doesn't play favorites. But in the temple, there were favorites. I think that was one of Jesus' issues with the temple. He spent a lot of time outside the Promised Land reaching out to misfits and Gentiles. Okay? I think the other issue, and this is the latest thing, I think that he had real issues with the whole worship of sacrifice, which was also a part of what was happening with the money changers and the merchants. If you're coming from Galilee, which is 80 miles, you don't bring your best heifer, because if that heifer breaks its ankle half a mile from the temple, it's no good to you for a sacrifice. It has to be a perfect animal. So you sell your heifer, pocket the money, and when you get to Jerusalem, you buy a heifer that Sylvia happens to have for sale. And you know it's good. Okay? So, the problem, I think, and this is not just N.T. Wright, but it's because of it's conversations that we have had with Rolf Jacobson, Old Testament professor at Luther Seminary. What kind of sacrifice is God interested in? Is He interested in the death of sheep and cattle? In the Psalms, God says, "The sacrifice acceptable to me is a broken and contrite spirit." That is, a serving spirit. In our day, like in that day, the best sacrifices are assumed to be the sacrifice. Sylvia will assume that the best sacrifice is the one that I make so that she benefits. Right? I mean, that's what the candidates are going to be offering for the next 2 years. We'll make somebody else pay so that you can get ahead. And the sacrifice that God is looking for is for me to make a sacrifice of my choosing, my volition, that benefits Alice. Right? Where it's not the animal that dies, but my self-interest. And I think that's the other issue that Jesus has with the temple. And it's why in the New Testament, what do we read? His sacrifice is the perfect sacrifice. And the end of all sacrifices, right? He sacrificed His life to prove God's love for us. That's a real sacrifice. Not that Warren Buffett has his taxes raised so that, you know, I mean, it's a sacrifice, but you know what I'm saying. Or like today with Kirby. Receive the sign of the Holy Cross in token that henceforth you shall know the Lord, the power of His resurrection, the fellowship of His sufferings. That's not about nails being driven through hands and feet. That's about the fellowship where Phyllis is willing to suffer to be a sister to Kareem. Or where, you know, we are, I mean, whether for our children, our neighbors, our brothers and sisters, where we are willing to make sacrifices to benefit somebody that God has given us to love. In my mind, that's why Jesus took on the temple. And who's interested in the sacrifice of sheep and cattle?
Merchants.
The clergy! That's what makes the high priest an aristocrat. He lives off those sacrifices. He's eating meat every day. Paul, a simple lay person, he's happy with a little bit of soup with maybe some vegetable. The high priest is eating beef, Paul, because you brought it to the temple. Okay? All right. Well, next week, we'll pick it up there with Wednesday of Holy Week, and we'll see where the conversation takes us.
Is that the same temple where Jesus was when he was 12 years old, and his parents thought he was with them, and he said, I have to be here
Yes.
about my father's
Yes,
work?
yes. Solomon built the temple, the Babylonians destroyed it. And that temple was said to be one of the 7 wonders of the world. So much gold that when the sun rose, you couldn't even look at the Temple Mount. That's what, in one of the books I read about Jerusalem. That temple was destroyed. Ezra and Nehemiah in the Old Testament tell the story of this rebuilding, or the building of a second temple, that compared to the first temple, was like a prefab building. They got a building up because Jerusalem should have a temple once the exile was over. Okay. Herod, who was not the house and lineage of David, but was king, he was a Hasmonean of the Hasmonean line. Herod, in order to curry favor with the Pharisees and the Sadducees, began a new building program to build a new temple to replace the prefab building and to again be one of the wonders of the world. That was the temple Jesus visited at age 12. It was the temple to which Mary and Joseph went 40 days after Jesus was born, because that's required of a woman who's given birth. And it was that temple that was destroyed in 70 AD.
And the Western Wall is still an existing wall from that.
That's all that's left of that temple complex. I mean, when we say temple, I think building. The temple was really a complex.
Right. But all that remains is the Western Wall.
Is the Western Wall. And so that's where you'll see Jews praying at the Western Wall. And why won't that temple be rebuilt?
Because it's in the middle of
because there's a mosque where the temple
right.
is.
Yeah. Okay.
And World War III would start.
Yeah.